political history of terror, the big why remains largely stuck in old patterns of thought. So this book follows a decade of work in Stalin's personal archive and the archives of other Bolshevik leaders. And among other things, these personal archives that were released in 2000 contain a great deal of intelligence. So general information on the domestic and international situation received on really a daily basis by Soviet leaders. So I've spent much of the last decade looking at that information and using it to understand the decisions that they took, right? So the information, the archives on the decisions was released in 1991, and the intelligence was released in 2000. So it's about sort of bringing those two together. So I was building a picture through that comparison of those two groups of information about how the leaders understood the world that they occupied. Now, on one level, these archives confirm many existing views that perceived violence was necessary to overcome resistance to revolutionary change, that Stalin sought to build a personal dictatorship. But what's particularly interesting to me is that it shows that Stalin and other Soviet leaders persistently misinterpreted the challenges to their rule and threats to the revolution. Historians have long known that Stalin had a great range of intelligence available to him, but there hasn't been much work on how it was collected and processed. And what I tried to show is that Stalin's drive to accumulate power and to smash resistance was intensified by a fundamental misperception of events. Now, the opening chapter of the book explores a paradox of power in the Russian state from its very beginnings to the revolution of 1917. Russian rulers accumulated extraordinary power and often asserted it with exceptional violence, so much like Stalin. But the power and its violent expression was not a function or an expression of confidence, but just the opposite. It tended to be an expression of perceived weakness and vulnerability. Those perceived vulnerabilities run like red threads through Russian and indeed Soviet history. So forgive me for a list here. One, we're talking about the perception of vulnerability to invasion, the problem of defending thousands of miles of porous borders, fear of palace coups, a recalcitrant and unresponsive bureaucracy, a fear of insurrection, of popular insurrection. Now, I'm not trying to argue that there's any kind of inevitability to a continuity across the revolutionary divide. I'm just observing that the Bolsheviks could not but inherit these vulnerabilities, and that we shouldn't be especially surprised if their reactions to those vulnerabilities were broadly similar. And yet certain factors contrived to intensify their perception of vulnerability and to make their reactions more violent. Here comes another list. So if we talk about kind of formative experiences for the regime, the Soviet regime. One, the Tsarist political police had thoroughly infiltrated the revolutionary movements. We're talking about provocateurs within it like Azev and Malinovsky, such that the Bolsheviks were never sure if their immediate colleagues were actually working for the other side. It's an insecurity about even that narrow leadership group. The experience of the First World War and the Civil War, so 1914 through to 1921, inured Bolsheviks to violence. It was an exceptionally violent 7-year period at the beginning of the Soviet regime. Third is ideology. So the idea from Marx and indeed from Lenin that proletarian revolution could only be attained by recourse to violence, and that once attained, it had to be defended ruthlessly and ferociously. previous revolutions had failed because they had failed to anticipate the strength of the reaction, of the counter-revolutionary reaction. The foreign intervention of 1918 to 21 confirmed for the Bolsheviks that the capitalist world had it in for them and would stop at nothing to destroy the Soviet state. Fifth, popular unrest, especially towards the end of the Civil War, confirmed for the Bolsheviks that they could not rely even on the support of the working class. Six, the state apparatus was unreliable. They were heavily dependent on class aliens, on bourgeois specialists, elements that were assumed to be hostile to Soviet power. And seventh, the party itself was unreliable, not only because of doctrinal and policy disputes at the top, but because the rapid growth of the party mass led to a dilution of commitment, a rise in corruption, and a threat that enemies could infiltrate it. Now, basically, the Bolsheviks spent the first 4 or 5 years in power extending their control, sort of solidifying their control. But at the same time, they were harboring a nagging sense that it all could fall apart very quickly if their multiple enemies united. They had every reason to believe that they had survived as long as they did because of the Red Terror in the Civil War. The violence of the Civil War period had been justified. Now, this is where the matter of intelligence, of information collection and its interpretation gets interesting. Historians, as I said, have tended to assume that the actual threat to the regime, as that threat receded, that the leadership was sufficiently well informed to that effect. In fact, this was far from the case. The intelligence services, and there were many, so we're talking about the Cheka, which became the GPU, then the NKVD, military intelligence, the foreign ministry, and other such information gathering agencies had been instructed to collect information on counter-revolutionary conspiracies and threats to the regime as the matter of first priority. And it's worth noting that it was never in their interests, and they were not generally given the opportunity to anyway, to say the level of threat had receded, or heaven forbid that it no longer existed. That was a good way to lose a job. At the same time, there was evidence of threat. So a very high degree of surveillance as existed within the Soviet Union was bound to uncover examples of dissent. Reports on public opinion tended to dwell on the negative and not to stress the positive, that is, support for the regime. Various groups, including the old intelligentsia, members of non-Bolshevik parties, dissident strands of Bolshevism, did tend to gather together and have what the Bolshevik leadership continued to see as, quote-unquote, counter-revolutionary conversations. In the Civil War, the Cheka had developed a taste for uncovering conspiracies. And there continued to be a basis for them doing so, in no small part because they had never been forced to uphold any kind of minimum standard of evidence. From the earliest days of the revolution until the end of the Soviet period, there had been a running battle between the political police and the judiciary, Commissariat of Justice, about standards of evidence. So the Commissariat of Justice constantly complained that innocent people were being detained, even executed, and that the political police had to be restrained. At various times, they succeeded in getting judicial oversight of political cases. But their gains were only ever temporary and generally short-lived. And this created a further incentive for the political police to insist that existential threats to the regime persisted. That was the way that they retained their power, right? And their resources. Foreign intelligence was pretty much equally skewed in the Soviet Union under Stalin and Lenin. Into the 1920s, intelligence agencies continued to see multiple threats on the horizon, that is, after the Civil War had ended. The million-strong white armies withdrew to Soviet borderlands, that is North China, Romania, the Balkans, and they remained at arms. A million Russian soldiers on the Russian periphery. They were ready to join a new intervention and were looking for opportunities to strike at the new regime. Foreign forces had also withdrawn, tired of war and unable to continue the fight in the face of domestic opposition to war. But anti-communist rhetoric in the capitalist world remained extremely strong, particularly in the light of communist uprisings in Europe. Soviet leaders naturally feared that a new intervention, a new invasion, could begin at any time, particularly as European leaders were anxious to put a decisive end to revolutionary uprisings at home. So the Soviets saw in official French contact with white leaders an effort to prepare for war, and in the meantime to support anti-Soviet white terrorism. French diplomatic efforts to build the Little Entente was directed, of course, at Germany. But Soviet agencies saw this alliance of states along its western flank, where much of the white armies were stationed, as furthering those preparations for a new invasion. They were convinced that the French and the British were behind the Polish invasion of 1920, and that British efforts to contain the spread of communism in Turkey, in Persia, in Afghanistan, and China were actually attempts to prepare more fronts, again, for a new invasion. Diplomatic and military contacts of the major capitalist powers with counterparts in states on the Soviet periphery were observed and were reported to Bolshevik leaders, and that intelligence painted a compelling picture for Soviet leaders of a broad conspiracy to invade and overthrow the regime. It was, of course, almost entirely wrong. Many prominent figures in Europe would have supported a new war against the Soviet Union, but they were a small minority. Diplomatic and military meetings that the Soviet intelligence agencies observed were in their vast majority about dealing with the threat from Germany and not from the Soviet Union. And the agencies did little to fight the bias built into their instructions. Indeed, most intelligence gatherers and Soviet leaders in turn remained convinced that the hostilities of the Civil War would be renewed or could be renewed at any time. Now, within the Soviet Union in the 1920s, there was a significant retreat from the politics of confrontation that had characterized the Civil War period. The threat of peasant rebellion was receding, agricultural productivity was rising, the economy was recovering, workers were returning to the factory in their number. But when Lenin died, the party lost a major unifying force. The struggle to succeed him was inevitable, and Lenin gloomily anticipated it in his last years and months. Struggle for power raged across the second half of the 1920s and poisoned what had already been tense relations among Lenin's chief lieutenants. And by the 1930s, it created a new worry for Lenin's eventual successor, Stalin. Would the old oppositions serve the new order, or would they continue to work to undermine Stalin's leadership on the sly? How many leading party officials in the late 1920s and 1930s secretly supported the opposition? So let me shift my attention for a moment to the rise of Stalin and the Great Break, that is the industrialization drive of the late 20s and the early 1930s. What I need to do here is to, in the interest of time, to compress what is a rather longer argument in the book. I argue in the book, and I have done elsewhere, that historians have misunderstood Stalin's rise to power. And by virtue of that, they misunderstand the nature of his power in the 1930s. In essence, I observe that Stalin was never able, as many historians argue, to use his position as general secretary to staff the party with people who were personally loyal to him. The records of the party secretariat show that pretty clearly. So the top 5,000 or so party officials tended to support him over his opponents because his policies appeared to be, broadly speaking, successful. And also because Stalin himself was broadly sympathetic to their interests. What these 5,000 or so leading officials did not understand was that when the crisis that Stalin's last opponent, Nikolai Bukharin, had predicted, that is, this drive, high-tempo industrialization will lead to an economic crisis, when the crisis that he had predicted finally struck in 1930, they did not anticipate that Stalin would enforce the fulfillment of planned targets. In essence, Stalin told these leading officials that their job depended on their ability to fulfill targets that were patently unfulfillable. Stalin thus created a profound disincentive for basically the entirety of senior officialdom to pass accurate information to him. These officials were forever exaggerating their need for inputs, they were hiding capacity, they were running down quality, they were simulating production in order to lend the impression that the plan was being met. Stalin was thus on a path of conflict with senior party and state officials, for reasons ultimately of his own making. And this was a situation, again, which he did not entirely comprehend. So if a breakdown of the relationship between Stalin and senior officialdom was one of the consequences of the Great Break, there are others that we need to understand in order to see Stalin's deepening sense of insecurity in the 1930s. The story of popular attitudes towards the regime is now reasonably familiar. That is to say, we've had studies of it really since the 1970s. So in the course of the first five-year plan, the regime had fought and won a war with the peasantry over control of the grain supply. So we're talking about collectivization. But the consequences of collectivization and the famine of 1932-33 was that the peasantry, still the majority of the population at that time, lost what little sympathy it might have had for the regime. Peasants don't like Stalin or the Bolsheviks. Surprise, surprise. Meanwhile, rapid industrialization had been funded, among other things, by suppressing the living standards of the working class. And that didn't exactly win the regime many friends among the rest of the population either. Though, of course, as Sheila Fitzpatrick and others have observed, the course of rapid industrialization engendered a kind of social mobility that did bring a meaningful core of support. But a lot of workers are not pleased with the state of affairs either. Now, if you think about it, the regime should have concluded that the onset of the Great Depression in the capitalist states, in the developed West, had lessened the danger of invasion. That would have been a sensible conclusion. But they drew the opposite conclusion. Following the logic of Lenin's theory of imperialism, Stalin argued that the depression was a crisis of overproduction that would intensify competition and conflict over markets and sources of primary production. So according to that logic, a war against the Soviet Union would solve many of the capitalists' problems, not least creating new markets for excess production and getting rid of the evil of communism exacerbating class tensions at home. Political events in Europe reinforced Stalin's vision. So the collapse of the Grand Coalition in Weimar Germany brought a sharp shift of politics to the right under Heinrich Brüning and the onset of emergency rule. Intelligence sources interpreted the rise of the Lapua movement and the fall of the social democratic government in Finland in June 1930 as a fascist coup. They had similar concerns about the rise of the far right in Austria and Romania. According to the party journal Bolshevik, the depression was deepening the dependence of Poland, Finland, and the Baltic states on the imperialist powers and making them a solid base for their aggressive plans against the USSR. The bloc, the anti-communist bloc, appeared to be getting bigger and more aggressive. Meanwhile, the political police investigations into the subversive activities of the capitalist states produced a steady stream again of evidence suggesting that they remained dedicated to destabilizing the Soviet borderlands and undermining the first five-year plan. So in 1931 alone, the GPU, the political police, arrested 15,670 people for terrorist activity, much of which they believed had been sponsored by foreign powers preparing the ground for an invasion. When the Japanese launched an invasion of Manchuria in September 1931, Stalin's predictions grew more pessimistic still. So at the end of November 1931, he wrote to Voroshilov, who was the commander of the Red Army. Quote, "Japan plans to seize not only Manchuria but also Beijing. It's not impossible and even likely that they will try to seize the Soviet Far East and even Mongolia to soothe the feelings of the Chinese clients with land captured at our expense. It's not likely to happen this winter, but they might try next year." The archive, Stalin's archive, is full of this kind of correspondence, not just with Voroshilov, but with all sorts. In retrospect, we can see that Stalin's sense of imminent threat to Soviet power was exaggerated by the one-sided intelligence he was receiving. His other concerns, however, were rather closer to the mark. The struggle with the peasantry had generated a deep and lasting hostility to the regime. The support of the working class was wavering in the face of high work norms and stagnating pay. His support among senior officials and the rank and file of the party was shaken by persistent crises and the extraordinary demands and violence of the period. Now, in the book, I say much more about the rising social and political tensions and fear of war that drove Stalin to consolidate his personal dictatorship. Stalin accumulated unparalleled power largely out of a sense of insecurity, a sense that not only his position, but also the revolution was under threat. But the process was not inevitable or linear in the way that it unfolded. So in the early 1930s, at the height of the confrontation with the peasantry, amidst the crisis of the industrial economy, Stalin accepted the necessity of responding to signals from below. Grain collection targets were lowered. Projections for industrial growth were also somewhat reduced. But perhaps most significantly, Stalin accepted the need to restrain the apparatus of state repression. The number of arrests for counter-revolutionary crimes decreased sharply in 1932 and again in 1933, and the Commissariat of Justice finally gained some ground in their long-standing struggle to restrain the political police and impose elementary standards of justice. But the potential relaxation of tension was never realized because of the Kirov murder in December of 1934. So I don't know how many of you sort of have some general kind of passing knowledge of 20th century Russian history. Sergei Kirov was a candidate member of the Politburo, so a colleague of, an immediate colleague of Stalin, and arguably a close friend, although it's a matter of dispute. I'm going to skip over most of the story of the Kirov murder, but assume well, let me not assume. Let me assert that there is a pretty solid consensus now. This was much in dispute in the 80s and into the 90s about whether Stalin was behind the Kirov murder, right? So Robert Conquest argued in 1967 that Stalin orchestrated the murder. But it's really the research of Matt Lenoe, wonderful collection of documents that he published in the Annals of Communism series. The book is called The Kirov Murder in Soviet History. Wonderful read. It really is. And I think he's more or less kind of got there a consensus that Stalin had nothing to do with the Kirov murder. It's really incredibly important for understanding the events that followed. In short, Kirov's murder convinced Stalin that he had become complacent about the seriousness of the threats that the regime faced. So he immediately lifted the curbs on the arbitrary power of the political police. Of course, he sets back then the Commissariat of Justice. He set in train a series of investigations directing the NKVD to, quote-unquote, look for the perpetrators, that is, of the Kirov murder, among the Zinovievites. There's a measure of rational calculation here. I mean, he could have said that, he could have sort of seen the Germans as behind it, or perhaps the Lithuanians, a foreign force, that is. But there were very good reasons for him to think that it was not a good time for them. And looking for the perpetrators among the Zinovievites made sense insofar as Zinoviev was a leader of one of the major oppositions in the 1920s, and Zinoviev had been the leader of the Leningrad Party. Kirov was his successor in the Leningrad Party. So it was not kind of crazy, that hunch that Stalin had, that they should chase that line of inquiry. Now, the most important point to make here, though, is that from the late 1920s, the political police had been instructed to put known oppositionists, and there were many, thousands, under surveillance and to report any conspiratorial activity. The regular reports that instruction generated served to keep Stalin aware of the enduring hostility of his old rivals and their followers. And of course, there were other various whisperings of dissent and opposition in the early 1930s. So, reasonably well-known episodes involving relatively senior political leaders who were critical of Stalin and Stalin's policy. So we can talk about Sirtsov and Lomenadze, Eismont and Tolmachov. There was this thing called the Ryutin platform. If you're a bunch of Russian history specialists, you'll think that I'm crazy to go into this. If you know what the Ryutin platform is. But Ryutin writes this diatribe at the end of which he says, Stalin really needs to be removed now. He's a disaster. And it's circulated, and how far it circulates is Stalin's obsession. It's like, who read that and who didn't report it? But so there's all this stuff going on before Kirov was assassinated. So when Kirov was assassinated, Stalin was inclined to think that conspirators from among the left opposition had changed their tactics from discussion, from these counter-revolutionary, conversations, which are not particularly threatening, to terrorist action, right? They're going to start murdering Soviet leaders. And of course, there's a long history in the Russian revolutionary movement of terrorism. And of course, NKVD methods, and I hinted at this. Now, when I'm talking about NKVD, this is the successor to the GPU. I'm still talking about the political police. NKVD methods, political police methods, as I sort of hinted at before, they were reliant on torture. So they never felt it was necessary to uncover material evidence of a counter-revolutionary crime because, of course, revolutionary conspirators are experienced and they know not to leave evidence. So when you capture someone, who seems a, likely counter-revolutionary conspirator, you beat them until they confess. And they believed what they got from their interrogations. And of course, that is virtually guaranteed that Stalin's hunch that the Zinovievites were behind the murder would be confirmed, right? There were enough people who, were sort of hostile in their own way to Stalin, and they would confess to, all of the many people that they were connected with. So Nikolaev was one of the first to confess, surprise, surprise, that his decision to assassinate Kirov had been influenced by Trotskyists in the Leningrad Party. So 843 former Zinovievites were arrested by the Leningrad NKVD alone in the 10 weeks after the murder. So a picture of a widespread Trotskyist Zinovievite organization began to emerge with its principal centers in Moscow and Leningrad. Logically, Stalin then ordered a review of security in the Kremlin. Okay, if they're going to start murdering Soviet leaders, we've got to make sure that we're safe. And that review of security uncovered a further conspiracy. The guy who's in charge of Kremlin security, a guy named Evdokimov, had many friends amongst former oppositionists and was letting them into the Kremlin, right? So Kamenev, this is another principle of the left opposition in the 1920s, was himself interrogated and admitted that his brother had been in his flat at times when, so this is Kamenev's brother, this is, I should have specified, that Kamenev and Zinoviev, the two major figures in the left opposition in the 1920s, were having conversations critical of Soviet policy and of Stalin. He categorically denied any link to events in the Kremlin and any knowledge of the political views of his brother, but his protests were not entirely convincing. So Stalin was kind of gathering this circumstantial evidence that members of the left opposition were conspiring against his regime. Now, the spring of 1935 represented a sort of crossroads for Stalin. The political police chief, the NKVD chief, Genrikh Yagoda, was presiding over the continuing surveillance of former oppositionists, combined with a massive verification of party cards intended to weed out party members whose political loyalties were in any doubt. Yagoda believed that the leftist underground was dangerous, but that the NKVD counterterrorism operations could and were containing it. But Nikolai Yezhov, whose recent and dramatic rise through the party apparatus had followed from his reputation for identifying enemies, sought to reinforce that reputation, particularly with Stalin, by presenting a unified theory of opposition activity. He wrote a book. In May 1935, he asked Stalin to read his manuscript called From Factional Activity to Open Counter-Revolution, in which he brought together materials from previous investigations to argue that Zinovievites, Trotskyists, and now followers of the right opposition were combining forces with agents of foreign powers to overthrow the regime. In short, Yagoda and Yezhov were presenting Stalin with competing visions of the counter-revolutionary threat. Stalin was not initially drawn to Yezhov's sort of ultra-conspiratorial vision. But several factors served eventually to change his mind. The first of these was a worsening of the international situation. So through the autumn of 1934, Soviet foreign intelligence sources were warning Stalin of an imminent invasion of Japanese forces from the east and German forces from the west, supported apparently by Poles and Romanians with the tacit approval of the British and French. Stalin was informed that these hostile powers had networks of agents in the USSR gathering intelligence, committing acts of sabotage, and attempting to rally opposition to the regime. Again, you have to remember that Stalin's not getting this in kind of general terms, right? He's getting individual, multiple, like scores and scores of reports of these individual acts of terrorism and sabotage. So I'm kind of generalizing here. I'm kind of giving you the general picture. But the picture that he's being presented, fact by fact by fact by fact, is compelling, even if it is essentially completely wrong. So the initial promise of the Franco-Soviet Mutual Assistance Pact, signed May 1935, which should have improved things, that is, it was intended to contain Germany, that the promise of that pact faded quickly, and German rearmament gathered pace. The Spanish Civil War, following fast on the heels of the signing of the Anti-Comintern Pact, made the coming of war, an invasion of the USSR, appear more imminent than ever. And indeed, there is a kind of sort of emerging Western consensus, like newspapers in Europe and America are writing about the danger of a new war. Then, second issue to consider is this problem of spies, and particularly foreign spies in the USSR in the middle of the 1930s. For years, Soviet authorities had granted asylum to foreign communists who had faced political prosecution at home. They're taking in foreign communists. In the mid-1930s, it was becoming clear that foreign governments had used the asylum system to plant spies. Particularly given their relatively high levels of education, these communist brothers were often given prominent positions in industry, in the party, the Comintern, and the intelligence agencies. A Comintern census from early 1936 concluded that since 1920, in excess of 35,000 foreign communists had taken up residence in the USSR. And the vetting process, the exchange of party cards, was churning up some very worrying data. Indeed, Poland very clearly was using the asylum system to send its spies into the Soviet Union. There's sort of more evidence than that. Never mind. A third source of concern for Stalin was about Trotsky's activities abroad. So Trotsky's actions, right, his literary work, he had been exiled, if you didn't know that, in the late 1920s. So abroad, his literary work, his appeals to foreign communist parties, the creation of the Fourth International, his involvement in the Spanish Civil War, all these things incensed Stalin and made him think that Trotsky was deliberately splitting the international communist movement at a time when the need for unity was especially great. At the same time, it was commonly accepted, and probably true, that Trotsky had a network of agents in the Soviet Union, though neither Stalin nor the NKVD were sure how big, how organized, and how active that network was. Now, on these first 3 points, Yezhov was gradually chipping away at Yagoda's authority by feeding Stalin the results of his investigations. These were investigations that were drawing links between Trotskyists and former oppositionists in the USSR, foreign spies, and fascist powers. Yezhov's breakthrough came with the arrest of someone named V.P. Olberg, who had recently arrived in Gorky, it used to be Nizhny Novgorod, from Germany. He was arrested on the suspicion that he was an emissary of Trotsky. Within a month, Olberg confessed to counter-revolutionary activity and began to name scores of co-conspirators. Zinoviev, Kamenev, Trotsky, and other prominent left oppositionists were implicated as the leaders of a terrorist counter-revolutionary organization. And as the investigation progressed in the torture chambers of the NKVD, evidence of Trotsky's links with fascist governments emerged. Olberg and others with links in Germany and the left opposition testified to the cooperation between the Trotskyists and the Gestapo in the organization of acts of terrorism against Soviet leaders. Now, Stalin demanded that the investigation should, as a matter of urgency, quote-unquote, expose and obliterate all Trotskyist forces, their organizational centers and connections. Now, this all starts to sound really nutty and far-fetched, and it's often argued that, of course, Stalin is kind of orchestrating and shaping these investigations and kind of pre-deciding their outcomes. In fact, if you look very closely at the investigative materials, they rely, and Stalin often attends these things called очные ставки, where person A accuses person B, and they bring person A and person B together, and person A says, you know, okay, so I know and you know that you're guilty of this, and person B kind of goes, you know that I'm not, right? And they kind of listen to them. They kind of listen to the that conversation, accusations, counter-accusations, and it is being present there that really serves to convince them that that Yerzhov is right. And I think here the problem that we have is that the former oppositionists truly retained a very profound hostility to Stalin. And if they weren't engaged in conspiratorial activity, they did meet one another all the time and talk about what a disaster Stalin was. And that made it very difficult for them then to, in the course of these investigations, and when they're being tortured, when they're in these очные ставки, to convincingly explain that the picture that Stalin was developing was not the correct one. In any event, the trial of the Trotsky Zinovьevite Center came in August 1936. And that put the seal of Stalin's approval on Yerzhov's investigations by making many, though by no means all, of the findings of his investigations public. It brought with it a fresh wave of calls for vigilance and new pressure on NKVD agents to unmask hidden enemies of the regime, and consequently it would generate further revelations. However, in accepting Yerzhov's theory of a wider conspiracy, Stalin did not deliberately set in motion the orgy of political violence known as the Great Terror. Rather, the calls for vigilance, this is an important point, began to ignite tensions that pervaded the Soviet political order and society. So let me talk for a moment about this phenomenon known as double dealing, dvoruzhnичество, to use the Russian expression. So double dealing within the party elite. And I've talked about this a bit so far. The pressure to meet economic plans had put appalling pressure on local leaders and economic officials, right? So as I said, they engaged in a wide variety of deceptive and corrupt practices to create the appearance of success and to contain the grave tensions that plan fulfillment generated. Tight leadership groups were absolutely necessary to sustain local power structures by deflecting blame for problems and by managing the flow of information to the center. When Yerzhov took over from Yagoda as the head of the political police, Yerzhov replaced all the local NKVD chiefs perceived to be loyal to Yagoda in order to facilitate his ongoing investigation into the activities of the former oppositionists. But this had the subsidiary effect of removing the linchpin of the leadership groups in the provinces. They were no longer able to contain the flow of information once the NKVD chief had gone. There is no evidence to suggest that Yerzhov had foreseen the consequences of that action. Now, Stalin was not wholly ignorant of what the regional secretaries got up to. So at the 17th Party Congress in 1934, Stalin observed some ongoing problems, including, and this is to quote him again, officials with well-known services in the past who think that party and Soviet laws were not written for them but for idiots. Stalin's speeches and press subsequently criticized familyness, семейственность, that those kind of closed networks in the provinces, this sort of way in which they protected themselves. So семейственность was his term for the habit of local elites to close themselves off from the party mass. His criticism of excessive purging of the party rank and file and the verification and exchange of party cards was an even more pointed expression of his irritation with their refusal to play by his rules. I really should unpack that. If you haven't read Arch Getty's 1985 study of the terror, that plays an important role. I'll need to explain that later because I'm truly running out of time. Once the NKVD chief had been removed locally, the key player in the suppression of criticism was gone. And these local elites could not any longer contain the details of their corrupt practices and resistance to central directives. So through the winter and into the spring of 1937, the drip of unfortunate details about regional leaders' activities was becoming a disturbing flow. Basically, Stalin was getting all sorts of information that he had been consistently lied to by, the sort of top 1,000 political leaders in the country. These guys made up, sort of 60% of the Central Committee. So they are being arrested through the spring and into the summer of 1937. Stalin was learning that the party elite was systematically disloyal to him. Briefly on mass operations. The book doesn't really have anything particularly original to say about mass operations. It isn't kind of important to the story of the origins of what I call the Great Fear, as it is important to the consequences, right? So the key figures in research on mass operations are David Shearer and Paul Hagenlow. And they note kind of that modern states monitor their population with the aim of isolating dangers and distributing benefits, right? Sort of the gardening state, modernity kind of argument. But perhaps more than any other, the Soviet states sought to engineer society through the politics of inclusion and exclusion. In the 1920s, they created the first of what were referred to as regime cities. And this involved the deportation of very large numbers of people to the periphery, which created in time an unsustainable situation in which people were being sent away from areas where work, housing, and the food supply were concentrated. The problem for the regime didn't lie in forced exile, but the problem of escape or return, right? So there's huge numbers of people in northern Kazakhstan or, eastern Siberia where you stay there and you die. So, you come back, right? And you're not allowed to, but you come back. So not only were tens of thousands of people, deported people, returning from exile, but by 1935 and 1936, hundreds of thousands of peasants exiled to the labor camps of the Gulag during collectivization. So hundreds of thousands of people who had resisted collectivization were exiled to the Gulag for 5-year terms. Right? By 1935 and 36, they're supposed to be freed. So the regime has this problem with people who they don't want to have to deal with. They have to deal with them, right? In early 1937, the head of the West Siberian NKVD, S.N. Mironov, reported that local kulaks, returning peasants, were forming insurrectionary organizations, повстанческие организации, wonderful Soviet phrase. Reports of similar organizations of kulaks, of Cossacks, returning Gulag inmates, followed from other regions in the spring of 1937. For regional officials, the concern was not limited to insurrection. Since the new constitution was announced in 1936 and the prospect of contested elections loomed, they reported to the center their concerns that anti-Soviet elements would take advantage of the process. Now, this found some resonance in the center. In March, regional NKVD officials were warned by the center to monitor the plans of church officials in advance of elections. We don't want, religious people participating in the elections. A month later, similar communications warned of the activization of former parties, of Mensheviks, of SRs, of other non-Bolshevik revolutionary groups, Trotskyists and rightists apparently planning to use the election as a platform for launching a campaign of insurrection. So the regime shares some of these concerns about these people. So this found a particular resonance among besieged regional leaders, who were not concerned only about the threat from anti-Soviet elements, but they were also generally hostile to the idea of contested elections, which promised to excite criticism of them. So this is really kind of a serious, for some reason, only really rude expressions come into my head. a situation in which kind of everybody's afraid of everybody else. In July 1937, Yezhov submitted what is known as Operational Order 00447 for the approval of the Politburo. So this is like the key order of the mass operations. In short order, many local organizations asked to have their figures raised. This is about kind of isolating and exterminating these anti-Soviet elements. So local organizations asked to have their figures raised. These numbers are too small. Let's have bigger ones. And by autumn, Yezhov seems to have agreed all of these extra requests immediately. So according to NKVD statistics, by the time the operation was brought to a close in 1938, 767,397 people, so nearly 800,000 people had been arrested, of whom 386,798 had been subject to summary execution. This phase of the terror, affecting ordinary workers and peasants, was the most lethal, because Stalin had become convinced that the revolution and his place in it was in imminent and mortal danger. He had come to believe, under the influence of Nikolai Yezhov and a profoundly dysfunctional information gathering system, that the capitalist powers were bent on invasion, that hundreds of thousands of Soviet citizens would welcome them and work with them, and that the country had been infiltrated by tens of thousands of spies working as an advance guard of the invasion. That thousands of former oppositionists were willing to resort to assassination and, for that matter, work with invading foreign forces in order to unseat him. Of course, in no sense whatever do I seek to defend Stalin's response, right? Though I am keen to assert that Stalin was not paranoid in the sense that he did not have some clinical condition, some chemical imbalance in his brain that drove him to oversee this program, this colossal program of state violence. The enduring debate between those following Robert Conquest, who see a strong state, and those who follow Arch Getty, who see a weak state, have failed to grasp that this was a strong state that perceived it was weak. And in that, intelligence and perception are key. So the other thing I observe in this book, and what I end the book with, and what I'll end with here, is that neither Stalin nor any members of the inner circle, of his inner circle, ever seem to have grasped how badly they misperceived their situation. In fact, the war, winning the war, confirmed for them that what they had done was unfortunate but necessary. And then the Cold War further confirmed for them, and for Stalin's successors, that the capitalist world continued to be out to get them, and that they had to continue to be vigilant about spies and attempts to infiltrate the Soviet Union and rally disaffection. But given that into the late Soviet period, the KGB, again this is the same political police, was still filling new cadres with stories of the glorious victories over the counter-revolutionary conspiracies that for all intents and purposes had never existed, or at least not nearly in the dimensions that they imagined, it makes one wonder to what extent Vladimir Putin, so much a product of that KGB system, carries some weight of that deep-set institutional misperception of the West.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That was really interesting. I guess that's what we might call an exploration of the paranoid style in Soviet politics. And I just wonder, the question about rationality and irrationality is a really central one. And in a sense, I took you to be arguing that that Stalin and the Politburo were reacting in what you could conceive of as a rational way, because it's a misperception of what is going on. And yet, if you look at the show trials, which are a central part of this, I think, which you didn't really deal with, you can see that those people who confess, Bukharin and other leaders, confess to having worked against the revolution from the very beginning. It's not just a recent development. It's that they've always been hidden counter-revolutionaries, and that seems to me to be so deeply irrational. It raises something we've been discussing quite a bit in the project, which is how far do conspiracy theorists really believe in the conspiracies that they claim to be uncovering? And of course, it's a complicated question, because you can persuade yourself, you can allow yourself to be persuaded, you can use conspiracy theories in a cynical, instrumental way. There are many different kind of gradations. So those are the kind of brief points that occur to me, and that really interesting description of the process by which conspiracy theory is operationalized and comes to cost hundreds of thousands of lives.
When it comes to the texts of the Moscow trials, it's possible archivally to trace the evolution of those, of the investigation, and how the investigation produces the text. And certainly those elements, suggesting that these leaders like Bukharin and Zinoviev and Kamenev were, from the time of the revolution, working to undermine Soviet power, are additions. There's no kind of, it's not in the investigative materials. But here, one of the, I think, things that's not particularly well understood about the political debates that took place in the 1920s, that struggle for power in the 1920s, is that they kind of work like party politics works anywhere, right? In the sense that, Labour never describes the Tories in kind of neutral, objective terms, right? They're just a disaster for the country, and the Tories describe Labour in the same, broad terms. And there is a very clear motive of sort of political assassination that is present in those debates in the 1920s, and conveys, is kind of a part of show trials generally. That is to say, once someone has been brought to trial, they're brought to trial because they are perceived to have been guilty. There's enough evidence of guilt of a crime. And once you've got them there and you're going to publicize that conviction, you then add those other little bits to kind of destroy them politically. Yeah. Right. So it's not in the investigative materials, but it's still, broadly speaking, they did genuinely believe most of what was in the concluding statements in the trials.
Okay, it's extraordinary how much, it makes you think of Erdogan and Turkey.